Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Bob Jones, who is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel, a former deputy district attorney, a fellow with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and the senior strategist at U.S. Special Operations Command, currently serving as a member of the SOCOM J5 Donovan Group. Mr. Jones is responsible for leading innovative thinking on the strategic environment and understanding how it impacts factors critical to national security, such as competition, the character of conflict, deterrence, and social stability. Bob Jones, welcome back to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's always a privilege to chat with you and of course through you with your audience. So let's dive into this and see what your questions are and see if we've got any new ideas to add to the conversation.
Yep. Dynamite. Looking forward to it as well. And just before we begin, real quick, I'd like to remind our audience that Bob Jones's opinions are his own and do not represent the opinions of Special Operations Command, the Department of Defense, or any other government agency. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Bob, will cover two articles that you wrote within the last year. One is called Special Operations at a Crossroads, Thinking Strategically at United States Special Operations Command. And the other is called Strategic Influence, Campaigning Holistically in Peace, Crisis, and War. And we will have links to both of those in the show notes for those who'd like to check them out further. Plus, I'd also like to maybe reserve a couple of minutes if we could maybe revisit some of the topics from your previous episode, which we'll also have a link to that in the show notes too. So I typically ask guests for their broad view of our current strategic landscape, but that's what you do all the time, and that's going to be the primary topic of this entire discussion. So instead, I guess I'd just like for you to tell our audience, what exactly is the SOCOM Donovan Group? I'm sorry, the SOCOM Donovan Group.
I like what you did there, though. Donovation. I think
okay. That's right.
That's
okay.
a perfect mashup. So Joe Miller was our J5, our Director of Plans, Policy, and Strategy for years. And I don't know, about 9 years ago, he decided that there was value in pulling aside 2 or 3, smart people from the team and sequestering them and freeing them from the urgency of daily tasks and allowing them to dive down and think deeply on some of the more important issues. And originally, the first issue was gray zones, and they developed that for General Votel, and it became an important part of his narrative as a commander, and for the Department of Defense, frankly, as we looked at what are these frustrating activities that are taking place in this fuzzy space between peace and war, is kind of how they described it. Over time, Donovan Group got heavily into technology, working with SoftWorks and helping with the whole innovation in that arena. Most recently, and my focus, it's more, as you've indicated, on what's happening out there in the strategic environment. How is this affecting the character of conflict? Where are there opportunities to think about problems differently or to refine our solutions to get to better strategic effects?
Gotcha. Well, I'm sure that keeps you and your colleagues quite busy for sure. All right. So stepping into your articles. So which article do you think would be a good place to start? The Special Operations at a Crossroad or Strategic Influence? Or if it's just kind of a mashup, go for that too.
Well, they were wrote in sequence. So what these papers were, they were actually chapters for larger white papers that were being organized and edited by the Joint Staff's J39 Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team up in the Pentagon. And what they were trying to do, as we have these new strategic documents that have been developed by the Biden administration, is to get perspectives from the major commands on first, with the first white paper, how are we seeing the strategic environment, and the challenges before us, and then with the second paper to dive into how are we thinking about potentially campaigning to advance the strategic objectives that are being placed to us, by the Joint Staff, by the Secretary of Defense.
I see. So the subtitle for your the second piece, the strategic influence piece, is, and you just mentioned it, but campaigning holistically in peace, crisis, and war. Could you? I mean, people probably have their own thoughts on what campaigning means, but could you recap what you mean by campaigning, and does campaigning differ significantly from competing?
Okay, and that's a great question, and it's particularly tricky for Special Operations Command because of the nature of our headquarters and how we're organized and what our role is. Ultimately, primarily what we do is provide forces through our theater special operation commands to be employed by geographic combatant commanders. So campaigning gets broken up into these regional pockets of activity. And so when I wrote this paper about campaigning, it was in full recognition that the SOCOM commander is not going to wage a global campaign, a global special operations campaign. But I believed it was important for us to envision what such a campaign would look like, recognizing that in peace, the State Department is in charge, right, globally, and we are always in support, of a larger State Department vision, and we are supporting that State Department vision through these theater SOCs and through the offices of the geographic combatant commander. So there's a couple degrees of kind of backing things up. Now, the challenge is there is no larger national State Department campaign plan for us to support. So what I had to do in my mind was basically create a straw man of, well, what would it look like if America had a campaign plan for globally advancing and securing our interests in peace, and how would SOF most effectively, most appropriately nest into such a campaign. So this is a vehicle for thinking about the problem, and a vehicle for thinking about the challenges, and a vehicle for thinking about how we would contribute to more durable and appropriate solutions. It is not a U.S. SOCOM, grab for power and glory that, hey, we're going to lead this glorious global SOF campaign. That's not what it is.
Right, but you're putting it out there, though, that absent any hard doctrine or U.S. government policy, SOCOM is intending to campaign, left of bang during peace and in crisis and in war, and doing that in a way that integrates with the other government agencies like the State Department.
100%. The population-based activities, which are so important to special operations, fully optimizing the capabilities of the force, as well as those things you need to do to be postured to effectively deal with crisis or to deal with conflicts wherever they might occur, requires doing your homework. So a lot of this campaigning is really about what do we need to do our homework to ensure that we have the right type of force, that force is in the places where it needs to be, that we've developed relationships with the right people and organizations, that we understand populations, and where is grievance towards us that we need to maybe modify our behavior to reduce that grievance, where there might be grievance towards some partner or ally, and maybe they don't see it because they're too close to it. So how do we help them identify and make changes as well, modifications of governance to reduce grievance? Because it's this grievance that is exploited by state and non-state actors, be it Russia, China, or Al Qaeda, ISIS. The energy in the system often is political grievance between a population, either domestic or foreign governance. But there's the other side of that equation is that our adversaries also create grievance in populations that they negatively impact through their actions. The China's Belt and Road Initiative is often painted as where they are out competing the socks off of us as they are spending money and fostering, influence across the globe. But for every place there's a winner, there's going to be losers as well. And in losers, there's grievance, and in grievance, there's opportunity. And the greatest challenge shaping our current strategies comes back to this issue of gray zones that we're talking about. And whereas the definition of gray zone is pretty artistic, it's like, hey, it's this space between peace and war. Of course, then the Chinese say, well, for us, everything is war. And there's a lot of American strategists who kind of adopt that same mindset. Personally, I think the competition is for leadership of a rules-based order. And if that's the larger competition, I think most people, most nations prefer to be led by a country that doesn't see everything as some shade of war. So when I think about the gray zone, for me, pragmatically, it's really the difference between what legitimate authorities profess the rules to be and what challengers believe that those authorities are either willing or able to enforce. And as power shifts between state actors, a rising China certainly chafes at the sovereignty they possess. And so they seek naturally to expand their sovereignty. And they'll do whatever they can legally to expand their position on the global stage. But when they run up against obstacles that they disagree with, obstacles being rules or laws or kind of how things are traditionally done, then they start to break those rules. And we get frustrated. They build islands in the South China Sea. They violate norms for international fishing, these types of things. And all of these tend to nick away at our leadership and nick away at the sovereignty of ourselves and partners and allies. And we grow frustrated because traditional tools of deterrence don't work very well in that space. If we were to provide a war response to an island being built or illicit fishing, then we would be escalating, right? And so there would be a risk of changing a gray zone competition event into an unwanted conflict. So there's a lot of frustration. So a lot of my work has been on, well, how can SOF work in that space to create new types of deterrence? Because we're not going to deter the gray zone by buying more ships or more tanks or newer missiles or faster missiles or bigger nuclear weapons, because the adversary does not believe that we would use those types of capabilities for those types of activities. So we need to develop a new family of activities. And it's been my argument that in this restive age that we are currently in, that by understanding political grievance and posturing to either relieve it where that is what serves our interests and the interests of our partners and allies best, or being postured to potentially leverage it, we can start to get inside the heads of adversaries and make them paranoid that we could destabilize activities that are important to them through the grievance that they created. Now, when I talk about this type of deterrence, I initially wrote a paper on this in 2016 and took it to the Strategic Command Deterrence Symposium and had it distributed to all the participants. And many experts on deterrence found me asked, during the course of the conference to explain to me that this wasn't deterrence at all. And I'm like, well, you guys are are probably right. I'm not a deterrence professional.
Yeah.
I'm an insurgency professional. I'm a population-based conflict professional. I'm a student and practitioner of unconventional warfare. But as I look at the strategic environment, as I see where we're starting to kind of lose control of the situation, it's along the fringes. War against the United States is deterred. War against our treaty allies is deterred. But where we're increasingly concerned and frustrated is conflicts against non-treaty partners like Ukraine or Taiwan, or these gray zone type activities where people are just kind of chipping away at the rules-based order and making us look, a little feeble, if you will, in our leadership. And it was my position that this
was back in 2016.
2016.
Yeah.
And we've continued to develop this and push the idea, and it's catching traction in different places as it continues to evolve. But the main thing is, I think, to recognize that in peace, this is a psychological thing, and to create deterrence against these autocratic adversaries like Iran or North Korea or China or Russia, you're really looking at getting inside the heads of four guys. And if you can live inside those guys' heads, if you can kind of nick away at those things that they are paranoid about, that they value, that they fear, and that they believe that will actually do, then you can start to create a network of potential deterrent effects globally. Indirect approaches. This isn't like posturing directly, like across the border from Ukraine or off of some island in the Pacific. This is posturing globally where grievance and opportunity exists in ways to make adversaries concerned. That we could do things to disrupt them, a thousand dilemmas that might give them pause from creating one big dilemma for us someplace.
Right. Wow. I guess I'd like to just maybe rewind just a little bit. This is a question that I have not asked in a while on this podcast, but I used to ask more often, but I think it's just appropriate now, and I'm curious to get your take on it. So you mentioned the State Department a few moments ago. It seems to me that SOCOM especially, but not only SOCOM, but maybe SOCOM especially, engages with the State Department perhaps more than some of the other large commands do. What are the touch points that you guys have within the State Department, and are there any relationships within the State Department that you would like to have like stronger relationships with? Just curious about that.
I think the most important touch points are, right at the team level, when that small team of operators goes to some country and they check in, with the country team, and they sit down and they have candid conversations with their counterparts from the various agencies like USAID, state, et cetera, that are involved, and they share information. They share information, they share perspectives on how do they see the situation, what type of capabilities might we be able to bring, what type of challenges are they concerned about, where do we see opportunities. So at that grassroots level, then as you build up from that, of course, then you have the theater SOCs, and those theater SOC commanders have robust programs of engagement, with the embassies and ambassadors, within their respective AORs. So this is bottom up, then as you get up to the higher levels, and of course, the senior commander, SOCOM commander is going to engage, with the State Department, directly, and his counterparts at that level. But as we mentioned earlier, of course, we don't have a global mandate, right? And State Department doesn't really create these type of global campaigns. No, so if it was like a king for a day, I think it would be very helpful, at the national security agency, State Department level, with a certainly a soft line of influence along with others, to develop a vision, for a global campaign, if you will, to advance and secure our interests in peace. But that's something we're really not organized for, and much of this work, of course, is done down at the lower level, and ambassadors answer to the president, right? So there's all kinds of structural things that perhaps nick away at our efficiency, and that's something, as the United States looks at how do we evolve our institutions and approaches for policy and governance and security going forward. What of these things are things that we need to cling to, and what are things that need to be modified slightly? Maybe some it's time to retire them. None of those are my concern or our decision. But if we do recognize that the world has fundamentally changed, then I think the idea that the institutions and kind of processes that brought us here are the ones to take us forward doesn't really stand the sniff test. So we probably are overdue for a significant review, if not overhaul, of the mechanisms and institutions of how we engage the world and lead a rules-based order. Over.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to the next question I want to ask. And so, as we were collaborating on, sketching out an outline for this discussion, someone else suggested to get your take on, this kind of change that you were just talking about. And so the question is that it seems like we've been talking about change, I don't know, since 2016, 17. I don't know if you just put like a marker on the calendar, like with the Russian meddling in our 2016 elections, and then say we've been talking about change ever since then, or when the unipolar moment ended, wherever you draw that line, and yet it seems like change is just not happening fast enough. So what is your take on how to more broadly move DoD and the U.S. government in the right direction?
Well, one of the inherent strengths and weaknesses of democracy is that we turn slowly.
Maybe that's
right?
Is that a feature or a bug? I guess it's both.
It's both, right? It's both, and of course we all hear it in the news where some politicians wish they had more power to act more directly. I think we have seen in general a gradual shift in power from the Congress to the White House that probably plays a larger role in our instability than we give it credit.
Over the course of several decades, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this isn't like any particular party or individual, but it's a trend, right? It's a trend in the post-Cold War era where Congress getting things done through the Congress is difficult. So maybe you just get a court decision or write a presidential kind of declaration and move important issues often forward. But then they get moved back just as quickly by the next guy, right? So,
right. Some of the podcast discuss. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night. And some of the discussions I've heard, related to the Constitution and these kinds of issues is that the framers of the Constitution would be just absolutely bewildered that Congress, Article 1 of the Constitution, has abdicated or has offloaded so much of their power and responsibility to the executive branch. They would just be absolutely befuddled by where we find ourselves right now. Speaking to what you were just talking about.
Well, so when the first paper, I would say, well, we're at a crossroads. Well, it's not just soft; it's at a crossroads, right? The entire nation is at a crossroads. Perhaps the entire globe, right, is at a crossroads. And I think every institution, is struggling to kind of find themselves, and make those important changes But yeah, so at a time like this, though, however, there becomes a divergence between the right answer, and the good answer. And the right answer, of course, is, well, this is what the doctrine says, this is what the book says, this is what the plan says, this is what the definition is. And it's easy to kind of cling to the right answer, but as I think the empowering of populations is really kind of revealing that some of the right answers have errors baked into them, and so we're at a situation where we need to look at these things, but we need to be careful because some will be calling to change something, because it's an irritant to their ambitions, as opposed to like, no, this is a problem. So we need to be really careful. I wrote in 2011. I wrote a paper on a grand strategy of empowerment, if you will, and kind of my thought then, as I saw this dynamic occurring and this shifting of power, from governments to populations, and kind of how control-based approaches were becoming more difficult, more provocative, and perhaps unnecessary, and that maybe more influential approaches would be important. I was struck by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's vision for a post-World War II U.S.-led rules-based order, and as he envisioned it, it was very different than what it ultimately became, through the course of the Cold War. He had his four freedoms, of course, which are a little too fuzzy to stand on their own, but and everybody kind of remembers those.
Right, from the Norman Rockwell paintings.
Right, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom from want. But there were other elements. There were the four policemen. At the time, ironically, if you think about it in today's framework, the UK and the US and Russia and China, the four allies coming out of World War II, were going to work together in a new security alliance to replace the failed League of Nations. And I think there's some value in that, but maybe it's the 6 policemen or the 10 policemen. And can we evolve to a more delegated and distributed approach to global security, where there are regional leads and teams that make regional sense, that are built around those regional leads, where the U.S. becomes more of a facilitator and a participant, as opposed to the, kind of the be-all decision maker leader of a system. So if something happens in the Indian Ocean, if India was the lead for that region, we could turn to India and say, India, how do we help you? All right. And work with that team to help them be successful. But everything's not dropped on the shoulders, the United States president. Other elements were the end of colonialism. And we see this every day, where old lines drawn on maps and grievances that are, built over decades and centuries into populations are still ticking time bombs that need to be addressed. And that's hard work. And then the last piece was the advancement of self-determination. And frankly, the United States has a fairly significant fear of incompatible isms, whether it's communism or Islamism. These things are incompatible with liberalism. And I think we forget that, of course, liberalism was incompatible with how the kings of Europe thought things should be done, back in the day. But there is a lot of power in allowing self-determination. So if you just look at like Afghanistan as an example, we took out the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban government, and then we replaced it one with we thought would be best for us. And then we spent 20 years trying to get the Afghan people to buy into the idea that a government created by foreign powers and backed and funded by foreign powers and protected by foreign powers, was somehow a legitimate government for them. And 100 years ago, you could get away with that. 200 years ago, absolutely. But in this emerging strategic environment, we need to realize that while technically we might have the power to stay in a place like Afghanistan forever and to force the population to bend the knee, if you will, to a government that we deemed best for them, that's very provocative and probably unnecessary to our interest. And if we would just allow self-determination to occur and stick our hands out to whoever a population picks to lead them, and swallow our pride and hubris and say, okay, let's be frank, you're not our first choice.
Mm.
But this region is important. The people who live here are important. So therefore, the governance of these people is important to us. And so how do we help you be successful?
Right.
And kind of take our thumb off the scale, and that's hard. Okay. And so, because we have these muscle memory of doing this, and it really started in 1949. 1949 was a tough year for the United States, and it really kind of knocked the wind out of FDR's vision. We were doing a lot of great stuff. We created NATO in 1949. We um, um, did the Berlin airlift, but the Soviets detonated a nuke, and Mao prevailed in China, and suddenly containment mission had expanded from Sovietism to communism. As populations of Southeast Asia saw communism as a pathway out of colonialism. We really felt like things were starting to unravel on us, and so we started compromising on some of these founding values. But I think now, though, it's time to kind of reset and go like, wait a second, what are the principles that we were based upon as a nation, and how do we shift, to a more influential approach? And I think SOF has a unique value proposition, if you will, of supporting, such a transition and those types of approaches in ways that are less likely to, provoke unnecessary friction, through their application.
Right, right. Now's maybe a good time to take a moment and revisit the topic of your previous podcast appearance, and to our audience, link in the show notes, but on governance. And you've touched on it a couple of times, but my recollection, big takeaway from that previous discussion from you was that it is really important for leaders, and I mean, I guess all the way down to the special operator, to be able to take the perspective, or to understand the perspective of the various different peoples and stakeholders with whom you are engaging. And it doesn't necessarily imply that you favor their position, but you at least have to know it and honor it, and be able to say, whatever their grievance is, they may not be acting in a way that we find acceptable, but at least I can understand what maybe that little kernel of truth is, that is the seed of their grievance. And so, leaders ignore those kinds of dynamics in this landscape, at their peril. Do you think you could just take that in whatever direction you think is important, and maybe even drop it into some of the things that are happening in the Middle East right now?
Yeah. The I guess I need to back up a little bit. So,
All right. Yeah.
we have, and then we'll hopefully race back forward. But the we have a family of definitions that for these types of population activities that are, many of them derived, from an age of colonialism, and they contain the bias of governments, the bias of race and legality. I mean, like anytime a population acts out to challenge domestic governance or foreign policies, invariably they are breaking the law. Because otherwise it's democracy. If a population is acting out legally under the laws of their government to challenge government, that's democracy in action. But once they cross the Rubicon, it's not a Rubicon of violence, as the definition would tell us. It's one of legality. It's when a population breaks the laws of their government to coerce, political change and these grievance-based outbursts, that they have crossed the Rubicon, and then they become revolutionary. I find interesting, and as I look at this, is that we've kind of bundled all of this together, and we'll just call it insurgency, or even more simplistically, we'll call it resistance, because a population is resisting, some source of governance, and it becomes conflated, as a single problem. But when you break the problem apart, there's conflict between, and then there's conflict within. And so if a population is acting out illegally to coerce change on their own government, it's population based, it's political and primary purpose, it's internal, but it's illegal. So really the only difference between democracy and revolutionary insurgency is legality. So revolution, we should probably better think of it as an exercise in illegal democracy. And the fastest way to cure illegal democracy is to ensure that populations have trusted mechanisms to engage in legal democracy, right? And then the second most important thing to do is to have empathy with the demographic where this grievance is manifested and how they feel about governance, and work to mitigate that grievance, right? To make that population feel included. And this was really the mechanisms behind the civil rights laws that were passed back in the 60s. We expanded the circle of trust, if you will, to make the African American population feel more included, within the system. And then we, ensured that those, important things like voting rights acts, et cetera, were done so that they felt like they could participate in meaningful ways in governance. But this is very different than when a population in the eastern Ukraine and how they feel about Russian occupation, or how a population in Afghanistan felt about NATO and the United States being there for 20 years to try to make them, accept some form of government. This is resistance. I mean, this is how a population feels about a foreign source of government. And because it's between as opposed to within, it's the difference in the relationship between the parties that changes the nature of the problem. Okay, so just as if you had an altercation with your spouse or your son or daughter, is very different than if you had an altercation with a stranger. And it's because of the durability of the relationship, it changes the nature of the conflict. And so what's missing in our doctrine is this recognition that these things often happen together in the same space. So like if you were in Afghanistan, we can take that example and say, there was revolutionary energy and grievance towards the government of Afghanistan that we created and propped up and secured and funded. But there was also grievance against us for being there and doing those things. Revolution and resistance and the fusion of those two. But because we didn't recognize it in our doctrine, we worked to help resolve the revolution, but everything we did to help resolve the revolution was making the resistance worse. So it's like bailing out water from the front of the boat and pouring it into the back. And historically, in the olden days, that was actually good enough for government work, because we were just there to make sure that the government was uncoerced and preserved and the insurgent was defeated. That's what the book answer tells us is winning. But what we haven't fully, gripped is that, modernly, that's not winning. It never was. It was just suppression of symptoms in provocative ways. And now we have to actually address grievance and try to be less provocative. Because if you don't, internal and external actors, whether they are a state actor like China or Iran, or a non-state actor like Qaeda or ISIS, or an internal non-state actor like Hamas, they will tap into that grievance and they will leverage it for purpose. Okay. So we have to recognize, we have to be much more self-aware of how our governance, that is often well-intended and appreciated by large demographics, but how it is perceived by other demographics, and to be as inclusive as possible to ensure the entire population perceives itself to have trusted, legal, effective, trusted mechanisms for addressing grievance, to not be dismissive of grievance we disagree with. I see a lot of that. Well, we saw it in the 50s and 60s, people would be dismissive of the grievance of African American society. People are dismissive of the very real challenges, particularly in the justice arena with African American society, right? But you see it with how people are dismissive of what they call, Donald Trump's base. But they're not understanding that Donald Trump didn't build his base. That base is a demographic built around grievance towards the governance of the Democratic Party. He's an exploiter of grievance, not a creator of grievance. But that's legally. So these things can be disruptive, even if they take place within legal frameworks. But when they go into illegal frameworks, like we're seeing, where you have Hamas tapping into the grievance of a Palestinian population, particularly within Gaza, and then leveraging that grievance to create the instability and the violence that we're seeing there. And then you see the reaction, of the people of Israel. Reasonably, they're reacting, just like we reacted reasonably post 9/11. But our reaction to post 9/11, validated the narratives of our adversaries, and the excessiveness of Israeli response in Gaza is going to validate the narratives of actors like Hamas or Hezbollah or of Iran. So in the olden days, pre-globalization, pre-information age, governments could do these things. This is the old playbook, but the old playbook is obsolete. So the old playbook is, hey, use your power. Use your power to exercise control over the places and the people where you perceive yourself to have interests. Adopt or create governments that will prioritize your interests over the interests of their own people. Preserve those governments against all challengers, foreign and domestic. This is the playbook, and this is a playbook that on our watch, in this post-Cold War era, is fully obsolete. Okay, and so now that we're executing the book answer, but we're not getting desired durable results, right? You could create a temporary suppression effect of the symptoms, right? Like, in Iraq, where Gerald Petraeus, divvied up the problem. We gave governance to the Shia, we gave the Kurds their own autonomous space, we bought off Sunni Arab leaders, basically, and so we kind of got everything to settle down. And when President Obama asked, well, why are we still there with all these troops if things are stable? We didn't have a good answer, because we hadn't really differentiated between artificial stability, like occurs in a prison, and natural stability, right, where people are actually kind of happy and getting along with things. And so we took away the power, of our presence, and then the situation went to its natural state. And ISIS came in and outcompeted us for influence with the Arab Sunni population of Syria and Iraq. And soon we had a very big problem on our hands, because we didn't appreciate that we had executed a obsolete colonial solution, and that we had not, done the additional work of helping a artificially stable situation evolve into what could be a naturally stable situation. So this is causing us frustration, and certainly, we see the government of Israel is frustrated. The government of Saudi Arabia is frustrated. We remain frustrated here in the United States. This is not something that we've cracked the nut on, and we're still trying to do this old playbook. And I think the sooner, we can kind of recognize, the world has changed. Some of these old definitions are more descriptive than accurate, and we need to kind of scrub. We need to scrub our library of documents and go like, okay, what do we hang on to, and what do we need to modify, and what do we need to pitch? And most of the definitions in the whole realm of population-based conflict, insurgency, are very descriptive. They're telling you what something looks like unconventional warfare. Unconventional warfare, we still have a definition that basically describes what we did in the Netherlands and France in 1944. Hey, you went into a denied space. We worked with the underground auxiliary and the guerrilla force. We're going to coerce or overthrow. But if you back that up and say, well, fundamentally speaking, unconventional warfare is really any activity to leverage political grievance in a foreign population to advance your own interests. Now take that new more fundamental definition, then you can start to understand strategic influence. Because in strategic influence, it begins with understanding grievance, and then it transitions to okay, what is the grievance being caused by us, and how do we work to reduce that? What is grievance being caused by the governments of our partners and allies? How do we work with them to reduce that? What is the grievance being caused by some adversary? How do we perhaps take advantage of that to create dilemmas for them that could maybe cause them to pause when they're considering violating norms or rules to advance their interests some other place?
Yeah, well, you really brought that around full circle nicely, and those are very thought-provoking way to look at our problem set, and hopefully catalyze some change amongst the various stakeholders that need to cleave to your words. And with that, Bob Jones, thank you so much for being a return guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.